She didn't cry when she signed the contract. She didn't look back when she left everything she'd ever known behind. Claire Whitmore had made harder choices on emptier stomachs, and she would make this one count. But nothing, not her father's warnings, not her own iron will, had prepared her for the man waiting at the other end of that signature. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Claire's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The lawyer left without looking her in the eye. That told Claire Whitmore everything she needed to know about what kind of arrangement this was. She stood in the doorway of Ethan Calloway's ranch office, a room that smelled like leather and old tobacco and something else she couldn't name. Something that felt like grief pressed flat under years of silence, and she watched the lawyer's back disappear down the porch steps. The man hadn't offered her a handshake, hadn't offered her a word. Just folded his papers, nodded once at Ethan, and walked out like she was furniture that had already been delivered and signed for. She supposed in a way she had been. Ethan Calloway hadn't moved from behind the desk. He sat with both hands flat on the surface in front of him, and he looked at her, the way a man looks at a fence post. He isn't sure will hold the weight. Measuring skeptical, already deciding it probably won't. How was bigger than she'd expected. Not in a showy way. Just the kind of big that comes from 20 years of actual work shoulders, built from hauling and lifting and doing things that didn't have names in polite company. His face was weathered dark from the Montana sun, jaw set so hard she wondered if it ever loosened. His eyes were a flat pale gray, and they didn't soften when they landed on her. Claire lifted her chin and met those eyes directly. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was low, unhurried. The kind of voice that was used to giving orders and not repeating them. "I'd prefer Mrs. Calloway," she said, "since that is apparently what I am now." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth. More like a crack of irritation quickly sealed. "We'll see how long that lasts. I signed the same contract you did," she said. 6 months. In exchange for settling my father's debt to your bank and a living wage for my brother's education. I intend to fulfill every word of it." "I didn't ask what you intend." No, Claire said. "You didn't ask me much of anything, I noticed that." He stood up then, and she understood immediately why the workers outside had gone so quiet when she'd ridden in. It wasn't a threatening movement. It was just the movement of a man who had never once in his life had to make himself larger to fill a room. He simply was the room. "Let me be clear," Ethan said. "I needed a name on paper for the bank. I needed someone to satisfy the legal arrangement my late partner set up before he died, the one that requires a household to have a wife of record or forfeit the co-ownership clause. This is a business necessity, nothing more." "I understand." "Good. Then you also understand what I expect." "Tell me anyway," she said. "I want to hear you say it." He looked at her for a moment, like he wasn't sure whether to be irritated or impressed. He chose neither. "I didn't ask for a wife who thinks," he said. "I asked for silence." Claire held that sentence for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Then you chose the wrong woman. Or the right one, depending on what you're afraid of." The silence in that room was enormous. Outside, a horse nickered somewhere in the heat. The summer sun was pressing down on the Montana territory, like a flat, hot hand, baking the dust into the floorboards, turning the air to something thick and breathless. Inside this office, Ethan Calloway looked at Claire Whitmore, and she looked right back at him, and neither of them moved. He said finally, "Supper's at 6. Martha will show you your room. It's across the hall from mine and the door locks from the inside. I expect you to use that lock." "I already planned to," Claire said. He walked past her without another word, and she turned to watch him go, and she thought, "This man is not cruel. He is simply sealed shut. And there is a difference. A very important difference. She was going to need to remember that." Martha Doyle had been keeping Ethan Calloway's house for 11 years, and she had the look of a woman who had survived a great deal of weather, both literal and otherwise. She was somewhere past 60, built solid and practical, with gray-streaked hair pinned tight and hands that were never idle. She showed Claire to her room without ceremony and without warmth, but also without cruelty, which Claire decided to count as a minor victory. "Supper is at 6. Martha said exactly as Ethan had said, as though she were repeating gospel. Mr. Calloway takes it in the dining room when he's in from the fields. When he's not, he takes it standing at the kitchen counter and doesn't want company. You'll learn to read the difference. How do I read the difference? Claire asked. If he comes in through the front door, he's had a tolerable day, and he'll sit. Martha set a folded towel on the dresser without looking at her. If he comes in through the side door off the barn, you take your supper to your room. And which door does he use most often? Martha was quiet for a beat. The side door, she said. Claire nodded. Thank you, Martha. The older woman looked at her, then really looked the first time, and something shifted briefly in her expression. Not softness exactly, more like recalibration. You're not what I expected, she said. Most people say that, Claire replied. I've never decided if it's a compliment. It ain't either, Martha said. It's just fact. She turned to leave, paused at the doorway. The ranch hands will watch you. Some of them respectful, some of them less so. You don't go to the barn alone after dark. You don't argue with Mr. Calloway in front of the workers. And you don't ask about Mrs. Calloway. The last sentence landed with a particular weight. Claire kept her face neutral. Is that because it upsets him, or because it upsets you? Martha's jaw tightened. Both, she said. And then she was gone. Claire did not sleep well the first night. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, the creak of timber contracting in the cooler night air, the distant sound of cattle, something moving on the roof that she decided was probably a bird and not worth investigating. And she ran calculations in her head the way she always did when she was frightened and didn't want to be. 6 months. 26 weeks. She could survive anything for 26 weeks. She had survived her father's gambling debts accumulating for 3 years without a word of warning. She had survived the morning the bankmen came and took the house inventory while her father sat in his study and wept, and her younger brother Thomas stood in the hallway at 15 years old, trying not to understand what was happening. She had survived the conversation where the banker, Ethan Calloway's banker, as it turned out, had laid out the terms with the specific detached kindness of a man delivering a sentence he finds distasteful but necessary. There is a way to settle this debt and secure your brother's schooling, he had said. Mr. Calloway has a legal arrangement that requires a wife of record. It is purely administrative. He is a man of his word, and he will honor the terms. She had asked, what kind of man requires a wife he doesn't choose? The banker had looked at his desk. A man who has already buried the wife he did choose, he said, and does not intend to do so again. Claire had said yes before he finished the sentence, not because she had no pride. She had an abundance of it. But she had a 15-year-old brother with a mind like a steel trap and nowhere to put it, and she had learned the hard way that pride was a luxury that came after survival, not before. She stared at the ceiling of Ethan Calloway's spare room and thought, all right. 6 months. Pay the debt. Secure Thomas's schooling. Keep the peace. Get out clean. She was still telling herself that when she finally fell asleep. She found the ledgers on her 3rd morning. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd been looking for the household account book because Martha had mentioned in passing that the summer supply orders needed reviewing before the end of the week. And Claire had made the mistake of saying she was good with numbers, and Martha had made the bigger mistake of believing her and pointing her toward the office. The household account book was where Martha said it would be 2nd drawer left side of the desk. But the supply chain ledgers were sitting right on top of the desk, unlocked open to a page that was either an accounting disaster or a deliberate theft. And Claire stood there for a full 60 seconds, arguing with herself about whether it was her business before she sat down and started reading from the beginning. It was not an accounting disaster. It was a deliberate theft. Someone had been filing false supply invoices for at least 14 months. The numbers were subtle, never large enough in any single entry to trigger alarm, but consistent enough, systematic enough, that the total drawn out over more than a year was significant. Significant enough to matter on a ranch that was already carrying debt from a bad winter 3 years prior. Significant enough to be the difference between holding and losing. Claire sat in Ethan Calloway's office with his ledgers spread open in front of her for 2 hours and built the full picture in her head. And when she had it complete, she felt a specific cold anger that she recognized the anger of someone who has been robbed quietly and told to be grateful for what remained. She was still sitting there when Ethan came through the front door at 4:30. He stopped in the office doorway and looked at her behind his desk, with his ledgers open in front of her, and the expression on his face moved through surprise, then anger, then something that was working very hard to remain anger, and was not entirely succeeding. "What the hell are you doing?" he said. "Your supply chain ledgers have been manipulated," Claire said. She kept her voice level. 14 months, possibly longer. I can only speak to what's recorded here. Someone has been filing inflated invoices and drawing the difference. The total is... She turned a page pointed. "Here." He didn't move from the doorway. "You went through my ledgers. Martha told me to review the household supply accounts. Your ledgers were on the desk. The household accounts are a separate book. I know that. I found both." She met his eyes. "Ethan, someone on this ranch is stealing from you. I can show you exactly how, and I can show you a pattern that will tell you roughly when it started, which should narrow down who had access. Do you want to see it or not?" The name had slipped out without thinking Ethan instead of Mr. Calloway, and she saw him register it, that brief tightening around his eyes. But he didn't correct her. He crossed the room in 4 long strides and looked at the page she was pointing to. He was quiet for a long time. His jaw worked. She watched his hands both flat on the desk, and she thought he already knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what or how bad or how to prove it. "You were hired to keep house," he said finally. His voice was very quiet. "Not to fix my world." "Your world was already broken," Claire said. "I just stopped it from bleeding quietly." He looked at her. Then not the measuring look from the first day. Not suspicion or irritation. Something different. Like a man who has been so long in darkness that a struck match is briefly more alarming than the dark was. "Who did you tell?" he said. "No one. I came directly to you." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because it's your ranch," she said, "and your decision what to do about it. I'm not here to take things out of your hands, Mr. Calloway. I'm here to put facts in them." He straightened. He moved away from the desk to the window and stood with his back to her for a long moment. Outside, the summer light was going amber, the fields stretching long and golden toward the tree line. Claire waited. "Cal Jensen," Ethan said finally. "He manages the supply orders. I can't name names yet from the ledgers alone," she said carefully. "But if you can tell me who had authority to file and approve invoices over the last 14 months, I can cross-reference the pattern and make it a great deal more specific." He turned around and looked at her with an expression she still couldn't fully read. "You learned accounting from your father." "My father taught me to keep books when I was 12, she said. "Before the gambling got worse, he was a very good banker. The irony is not lost on me." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. She wasn't sure this man still did those, but the shadow of one there and gone before she could be certain. "I'll pull Jensen's records," he said, "tonight. I'll stay if you want a second set of eyes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Supper first. Martha made actual food, and she'll be insulted if it goes cold." Claire nodded and stood gathering herself. As she passed him on the way to the door, he said very quietly, almost like he didn't mean to say it out loud, "You're not what I expected." She paused. "Martha said the same thing." "What did you tell her?" "That I haven't decided if it's a compliment." This time, the something at the corner of his mouth was definitely more than a shadow. "It ain't a compliment," he said. "It's just fact." She walked out of the office and thought, "Well, that's 2 of you who've noticed. It's a start." Thomas came on the 4th day. He arrived by the afternoon stage, 17 years old, and trying very hard to look like he wasn't terrified, and Claire met him at the road gate and hugged him before he could get too far into performing calm. He hugged her back hard enough that she knew she'd been right to. "You all right?" he said against her shoulder. "I'm fine," she said. "Better than fine. How was the journey?" "Long and dusty, and the man across from me talked about cattle prices for 4 hours straight." He pulled back and looked at her, scanning her face the way he always did, reading her the way she'd taught him to read ledgers for the gaps, the things not entered, the spaces where something should be and isn't. "You're sure you're fine?" "I'm sure," she said. "Come and see the place." He looked past her toward the ranch house, and his expression was complicated. "He treating you decent?" "He's treating me as something between a business arrangement and an unexpected variable," Claire said, "which honestly is about what I expected." "That ain't the same as decent." "No," she agreed. "But it ain't indecent either. There's a difference. Come on." Thomas met Ethan at supper, and Claire watched the two of them circle each other the way cautious animals do, both sizing, both guarded, neither willing to show the first uncertainty. Ethan asked Thomas direct questions in that flat, unhurried voice. What he was studying, what he intended to do with it, whether he was of a mind to work for his keep during the visit, or intended to be a guest. Thomas answered each one with a precision that clearly surprised Ethan, though Ethan did not let that show beyond a slight pause before his next question. Martha served and said nothing, and watched everything. After, when Thomas had gone to the room, Martha had made up for him, and Martha had retreated to the kitchen. Claire sat at the far end of the dining table with her tea going cool, and thought about the ledgers, and thought about Jensen, and thought about the 6 months stretching ahead of her like a road she couldn't see the end of. Ethan came back through from the kitchen and stopped when he saw her still at the table. "Your brother's got a sharp mind," he said. "Yes," she said. "He does. That's why it matters where he goes to school." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He pulled out a chair not close several seats down and sat, which surprised her. He set a glass of water on the table in front of him and turned it once between his palms. "Jensen's records came up clean," he said. "On the surface." "They would," Claire said. "Whoever is doing this is careful. Clean surface records are how you stay undetected for 14 months. She paused. "Did you check the delivery confirmation logs against the invoices?" He looked at her. "The what?" "The delivery confirmations. Every supply order should have a receipt of delivery signed by whoever accepted the goods. If invoices are being inflated, the delivery confirmations won't match. They'll show the actual amount delivered, not the billed amount." She watched his face. "You do keep delivery confirmations?" "Somewhere," he said slowly. "Martha might know where." "Tomorrow," Claire said. "First light if you want." He nodded just once and turned his water glass again. Outside, the summer dark had settled in full, and the ranch was quiet, except for the insects and the far sound of the creek. He sat there for a moment, like a man who had things to say and hadn't decided yet whether saying them was worth the risk. And Claire waited because she had learned that men like Ethan Calloway did not respond well to being hurried. "Why are you doing this?" he said finally. "Looking at your records. All of it." He looked at her directly. "You're smart enough to have found another way out. You're not the kind of woman who runs out of options." Claire held that for a moment. "My brother needed the schooling," she said. "That was the option that existed. I took it." That simple, she said. And then, because he was watching her with that measuring look again, and she had decided somewhere around the second day that honesty was going to be more useful than performance. "And because I wanted to see if I could do something hard. My father's debts cost us everything, and I spent 2 years feeling like I had no agency in any of it. This was something I could actually choose." He was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," he said suddenly, the way a man says a word he doesn't say often. "My wife. She would have liked the way your mind works." It was the first time he'd said her name in Claire's presence. It landed softly in the room, and Claire did not reach for it or press on it. She simply let it rest where he'd said it. "Tell me about her sometime," she said. "If you ever want to." He stood without answering, and she thought she'd pushed too far. But at the door he stopped and said without turning around, "Delivery confirmations are in the box room off the kitchen. Martha put them there after the winter inventory. There's a lot of them." "I'll start at the beginning," Claire said. He nodded and walked out, and she sat in the empty dining room with her cold tea and thought, "There is a wound in this man so old it has become architecture. He built himself around it. And he has no idea that the most dangerous thing on this ranch right now is not a thieving supply manager or a debt or even the summer heat. It's the fact that he just told me his dead wife's name. And for 1 second, just one, the seal broke. She turned her cold teacup in her hands and looked at the door he'd walked through, and she thought, 6 months, Claire. Keep your head. You are here to pay a debt and secure a future. That is all. She believed it completely. She almost did. The box room off the kitchen was smaller than a confession booth and hotter than one, and by the time Claire had been in there for 3 hours the following morning, she was fairly certain she understood why no one had bothered to cross-reference the delivery confirmations in over a year. There were 4 wooden crates of them. Receipts, invoices, handwritten logs, duplicate carbons, filed in a system that was generous to call a system, and more accurate to call organized chaos. And Martha had dropped a lamp on the crate nearest the door, lit it and left without a word or an apology. Claire didn't mind. She had work to do. She found the first mismatch at 8:30. It was a supply invoice from the previous August, 42 pounds of salted beef at a billed price that was 19 cents per pound above the market rate, with a delivery confirmation signed by one of the hands that recorded only 38 pounds received, 4 pounds short and 19 cents over. On a single order, the number was almost nothing. Claire wrote it in her notebook and kept looking. By 10 o'clock she had found 11 more. By noon, she had a number that made her set down her pencil and sit very still for a moment in the suffocating heat of the box room and breathe. She found Ethan in the yard coming in from the east pasture with dust on his boots and his hat pulled low, and she walked straight toward him without waiting for him to reach the house. He saw her coming and slowed, and something in her face made him stop entirely. "How bad?" he said. "Over the 14 months I can document somewhere between $800 and $1,000. She watched the number land on him, watched his jaw set, watched his eyes go flat in that particular way that wasn't absence, but was actually the opposite, was too much contained, too hard. "Ethan, it's not Jensen." "Then who?" "The confirmations are signed by Jensen, every one of them. But the invoices," she opened her notebook, turned it so he could see, "the invoices are initialed by someone else. Same initials every time. RD. He took the notebook from her hands, looked at it again. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. "Russ Delaney," he said very quietly. "Who is he?" "He was my partner's man. Took over accounts payable when—" He stopped. "When things changed last year. How long has he been on the payroll?" 16 months. 16 months. 2 months before the first false invoice. Claire let that sit there between them and didn't say what they both already understood. Ethan closed the notebook and handed it back to her, and she could see that his hands were absolutely still, which she was beginning to understand meant he was angrier than he was letting himself show. "I need to verify this before I move on it," he said. "If I'm wrong, you're not wrong, but yes, verify it." She paused. "Do you have anyone you trust to help you look at the physical inventory records? Someone who wasn't here when Delaney arrived?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Martha's been here 11 years, he said. "Then ask Martha." He nodded once and took the notebook with him when he walked away, and Claire stood in the yard in the full weight of the summer heat and thought that this was what it felt like to hand a man a problem that was actually going to hurt him. Not the satisfying click of a puzzle solved, but the weight of damage revealed. The fraud was old enough now that it had already cost him. Finding it didn't give that back. She turned and walked back toward the house, and nearly walked directly into one of the ranch hands who had apparently been standing close enough to have heard every word. He was broad and sun-darkened, somewhere around 40, with the specific stillness of a man who makes himself hard to notice deliberately. He didn't step back when she almost walked into him. He just looked at her with an expression that was not quite hostile and not quite respectful, and resided in a territory she recognized as waiting to see which way this goes. "Ma'am," he said. "I didn't catch your name," Claire said. "Holt," he said. "Bun Holt, I run the Southfield." "Mr. Holt, don't mean to be forward," Holt said in the tone of a man about to be forward, "but you've been here 6 days, and already you're in the boss's office in his records telling him who's stealing from him." "Someone was stealing from him," Claire said. "I found it. I told him. That seems like the correct sequence of events. Or, Holt said, it seems like a woman who showed up on a legal arrangement is moving real fast to make herself necessary. The implication hung there in the summer air between them, clear as a bell. Claire looked at Ben Holt steadily and thought about 3 different responses and selected the one least likely to create an enemy she'd have to manage for 5.5 more months. Mr. Holt, she said, if I were trying to manipulate my way into a position on this ranch, I would have started by making Mr. Calloway like me. I have not done that. I've made myself inconvenient, which is considerably harder and considerably less strategic. She held his gaze. The man is being robbed. I found it because I was looking at household accounts and stumbled into it. If you'd like to verify my math, I left the notebook in the box room. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not trust? Not yet, but the first withdrawal of active suspicion, which in Claire's experience was a reasonable starting point. Delaney's got friends in this crew. Holt said, quieter now. Men he came up with. If this goes the way it looks like it's going. That's Mr. Calloway's problem to manage, Claire said. Not mine and not yours, but thank you for telling me. Holt nodded once and moved away, and Claire went inside and thought, this ranch is full of people watching each other, and now they're all watching me. She filed that away in the part of her mind that handled things she couldn't fix immediately but needed to keep track of, and went to find Martha. Martha was in the kitchen, and when Claire told her what she'd found and what she needed cross-referenced. The older woman was quiet for a long time, her hands still for the first time Claire had seen since arriving. Delaney, Martha said flatly. You know him. I know he smiles too easy for a man doing honest work. Martha untied her apron and folded it on the counter with the precision of someone making a decision. Show me the ledgers. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the box room together, and Claire discovered that Martha's filing chaos had its own internal logic once you understood it, and Martha discovered that Claire's accounting instincts were both faster and more systematic than she'd expected, and somewhere in the 4th hour. Without either of them acknowledging it was happening, they stopped working around each other and started working together. At 4:30, Martha looked up from a delivery log and said, There's more. He's been taking from the grain stores too. Physical inventory, not just financial, skimming the top before it's logged. Can you prove that? I can prove the weight records don't match the usage records for 9 months running. Martha set the log down. He's been doing it long enough that he got comfortable. Comfortable men make mistakes. Yes, Claire said. They do. Martha looked at her across the crates of paper and said without particular warmth, but with something that felt like acknowledgement. You've got good instincts. My father taught me to look for what isn't there, Claire said. He was better at reading the gaps in other people than he was at seeing his own. Martha held that for a moment. Then, in the way of a woman who considers words carefully, Mr. Calloway's wife, Margaret, she was good at numbers too. He trusted her to keep the household books. It was the first time Martha had said Margaret's name in Claire's presence. Claire didn't look up from the log in her hands. She sounds like she was capable, Claire said carefully. She was remarkable, Martha said, and there was a grief in it so deep and so practiced that Claire understood immediately this was not a fresh wound. This was the kind of grief that had been lived with so long it had become part of the woman's resting posture. She was also the one who found the first irregularity in the ranch accounts the winter before she died. She told Ethan there was something wrong with the supplier contracts. He was going to look into it. Claire did look up then, and then she died, she said. Fire in the east barn, Martha said. She went in after the horses. A pause. She got all 3 out. She didn't come out herself. The box room was very quiet. Claire sat with that information and felt the weight of what it meant, not just the tragedy of it, but the specific terrible architecture of it. A man who lost his wife because she went back in. A man who had been sitting on a problem she'd identified right before she died. A problem he hadn't looked at, a problem that had apparently continued and grown and been joined by a second problem of the same kind for over a year. He blamed himself, not just for her death, for everything that came after it that she would have caught that she didn't live to catch. He knows, Claire said, not a question. He knows something was wrong, Martha said. He never went back and found out how wrong. I think... She stopped. I think it hurt him too much to look at the accounts. They were hers. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she gathered her notes and said, he'll look at them now, because he has to, and because it's the right thing for the ranch. She stood up. And because she would have wanted him to. Martha looked at her with an expression that was complicated and layered, and ultimately landed somewhere in the vicinity of respect, though Martha would probably have denied it if asked directly. You're more careful than you look, Martha said. I'm careful in ways that don't always show, Claire agreed. She took the notebook to Ethan before supper, laid out the full picture. The invoices, the confirmations, the grain store discrepancy, the timeline, and she watched him sit with it in the way she was learning meant he was not shutting down, but processing. Pulling things into alignment. Building the complete picture. The way an engineer builds a structure. Load-bearing point by load-bearing point. I need to confront him, Ethan said. Yes. Tomorrow, in front of the crew. She hesitated. Ethan? This ranch runs on trust, he said. If I handle this quietly, word will get out anyway, and it'll look like I'm protecting someone, or I'm afraid of the answer. I do it openly, or the damage doesn't stop at Delaney. She looked at him for a long moment and thought, he's right. He's also going to have to manage men who've been Delaney's friends, and that's going to get loud. Do you want me there? He looked at her directly. You found it, he said. You should be there. She nodded and left him to it. And that night, she heard him and Martha talking in the kitchen long after supper, and she could not make out the words. But the tone of it was the tone of people who have known each other through hard things, and she thought, good. Let him talk to someone who knew Margaret. Let him say whatever he needs to say before tomorrow. She almost made it back to her room before Thomas appeared in the hallway, lantern in hand, and concern written plainly across his 17-year-old face. I heard something's happening tomorrow, Thomas said. Who told you? The hand who's been showing me the Southfield Holt. He didn't say much, but he said enough. Thomas lowered his voice. Claire, is this going to make things worse for you here? I genuinely don't know, she said honestly. But it was already worse. I just didn't know the shape of it yet. Thomas looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since their parents' world collapsed, a kind of ferocious, helpless protectiveness that Claire found both deeply moving and occasionally inconvenient. You don't have to fix everything, he said. I know, she said. You always say that. I always mean it, and then you fix everything anyway. He exhaled. Just be careful. These aren't city men. Delaney's got friends here, and if he decides you're the one who cornered him. He'd be right, Claire said. I did corner him, but I cornered him with math, which is considerably harder to argue with than accusation. She put her hand briefly on his arm. Go to sleep, Thomas. Tomorrow is Ethan's fight. I'm just the woman who gave him the ammunition. Thomas didn't look convinced, but he went. Claire went to her room and turned the lock. She lay awake for a long time. The confrontation. The next morning happened, the way things happen on a working ranch, fast, practical, and without the slightest ornamentation. Ethan gathered the crew at first light before the morning assignments went out, 30-odd men standing in the yard with their coffee and their curiosity, and he walked out with the notebook in his hand and stood in front of them the way a man stands when he's been holding something in for a long time and has finally decided the holding is over. Russ Delaney was in the back of the group. He was younger than Claire had expected from the patience of the scheme, maybe 32, 33, with a pleasant face that had clearly served him well in his life, and eyes that were already doing calculations as Ethan started to speak. Ethan didn't explain. He listed. He read the dates, the amounts, the discrepancies, the pattern. His voice was flat and level, and absolutely without theater, which made it more effective than theater would have been, because every man standing in that yard understood this was not performance. This was accounting. This was proof. When he finished, he looked up from the notebook and looked directly at Delaney and said, You want to tell me I've got this wrong? Delaney's pleasant face went very still. For exactly 3 seconds he held it, and then he looked at Claire standing slightly to the right and behind Ethan, and something flared in his eyes that was not shame and was not quite fear, but was very close to anger. She put those numbers together, Delaney said. His voice was even almost reasonable. A woman who's been here a week who has a financial interest in how things go on this ranch. She didn't put the numbers together, Ethan said. She found numbers that were already there. I've verified them. A pause. Martha verified them. That landed differently. Martha was standing on the porch behind them and said nothing, but the crew knew her, and the crew knew what her verification meant, and Claire watched the shift move through the gathered men like a current, the ones who'd been Delaney's friends, recalibrating the ones who'd been uncertain settling, and a few who'd apparently suspected something for a while, and were visibly relieved that the thing they'd suspected was now someone else's problem to name out loud. Delaney looked around at the crew and made one more calculation and apparently decided the math didn't work in his favor. I want to see a lawyer, he said. You'll get one, Ethan said. In town. Cal Jensen, take him in. Cal Jensen. The young deputy's messenger, who'd been on the ranch for 3 years, stepped forward without hesitation, and Claire thought Ethan picked that man deliberately. Not Holt, who Delaney might have tried to work on. Not anyone Delaney knew well. Cal, who owes Ethan everything and isn't interested in anyone's games. Delaney walked with Jensen across the yard and didn't look at Claire again, which she thought was probably intentional. He'd decided she was the cause of this, and looking at her would be the same as admitting it. The crew dispersed. Morning assignments happened. The ranch went back to its business with the specific efficiency of people who know that work continues regardless of what happens around it. Ethan came to stand beside her on the porch steps, and they both watched Delaney and Jensen ride out the dust settling slow behind them in the morning heat. You handled that well, Claire said. I've had harder conversations, he said. I know. She paused. Martha told me. About Margaret and what she found in the accounts before the fire. He was very still. Ethan, I'm sorry. He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was very quiet and very controlled in the way of a man who has had 11 years to build walls around a specific room inside himself. She was right, he said. She told me something was wrong, and I told her I'd get to it. I was in the East Fields for a week and I thought it can wait. A week? What's a week? You didn't know. No, he agreed. I didn't know. A long pause. I've been not knowing for 11 years and the accounts kept bleeding, and I kept not looking at them because she's the one who looked at them, and looking at them felt... He stopped. Like losing her again, Claire said quietly. He turned his head and looked at her, and the expression on his face was raw in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen. And then it was gone, sealed back behind the gray-eyed measured stillness, and he looked back at the empty road where Delaney's dust was already settling. She would have found Delaney in a week, he said. Half a week. Probably, Claire agreed. You found him in 6 days. She didn't answer that. She didn't think he meant it as a comparison. She thought he meant it as a different kind of accounting. A grief arithmetic that didn't resolve into anything clean and wasn't supposed to. They stood there for a moment in the summer morning side by side on the porch steps, not close enough to touch, and a hand named Cooper, who'd been watching from the fence line, caught Claire's eye and gave her a short, deliberate nod. She nodded back and filed that away too. Another small recalibration, another man deciding which way he was going to stand. It was not acceptance. Not yet. But it was something. Thomas nearly ruined it 3 days later. He had been trying. Claire knew that. He was 17 and brilliant and deeply unaccustomed to the specific social physics of a working cattle ranch, where authority was demonstrated not through argument, but through competence, and where being the book-learned younger brother of the boss's contract wife put you in a position that required a particular kind of careful navigation that Thomas had never needed to learn before. How was also, as it turned out, not very good at watching men do things incorrectly without saying so. It was Holt who found Claire in the kitchen and told her with the brevity of a man delivering bad news, he'd rather not be delivering, your brother got into it with Crane. Crane, she repeated. Big loud, been here 8 years. Thinks he knows the right way to mend a fence, and he's not always wrong. Holt paused. Your brother told him in front of 4 other men that he was doing it the wrong way. Was he? Holt paused longer this time. Yes, but that ain't the point. Claire was already moving. She found Thomas and Crane behind the south barn and the situation had already moved past argument into the territory where men get very quiet and very close, and the next thing that happens is either an apology or something nobody can walk back. Crane was enormous. He made Ethan look slightly less imposing, which was an achievement, and he was looking at Thomas the way a man looks at a lit match that's gotten too close to something flammable. Thomas was holding his ground, which Claire admired and also found deeply alarming. "Thomas," she said, walking in between them without breaking stride, putting herself squarely in the space. She looked at Crane. "Mr. Crane, I apologize. My brother doesn't always know when to keep what he knows to himself. He means no disrespect." Crane looked down at her with an expression that was recalculating rapidly. A woman had stepped into his argument, and the specific unwritten rules of this particular kind of situation meant that hitting her was not an option, which meant his options had narrowed considerably. "Your brother called me ignorant in front of my crew," Crane said. "He said you were doing it wrong," Claire replied, "which is not the same thing as ignorant, and he should not have said it the way he said it regardless." She looked at Thomas over her shoulder. Thomas, to his credit, looked at the ground. "I'm sorry, Mr. Crane," he said with the specific tone of a boy who is genuinely sorry for the manner of a thing, and not at all sorry for the content, but has the presence of mind to understand that the distinction doesn't help him right now. Crane looked from Thomas to Claire and back, and some of the locked tension went out of his shoulders. Not all of it, but enough. "Keep him out of my fence crew," he said, and walked away. Thomas let out a long breath. Claire turned on him. "What were you thinking?" "He was using the wrong gauge wire for the tension load," Thomas said immediately and completely unrepentant. If he'd finished it that way, the whole section would have come down in Thomas. In the first hard storm. "I believe you," Claire said. "I believe you entirely. And next time you see someone doing something incorrectly on this ranch, you will find either Holt or Mr. Calloway, and you will tell them quietly and privately and let them handle it. Do you understand me?" Thomas looked at her with the expression of a boy who knows she is right and resents it. "This is a strange world," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Welcome to it." Ethan had been watching from the fence line. He said nothing about it at supper, and said nothing about it afterward. But 2 days later, he told Holt to put Thomas with the fence crew on a different section, one that was actually using wrong gauge wire, and didn't explain the assignment. Holt told Claire. Claire didn't say anything to Ethan about it, but she thought about it. She thought about the fact that he'd heard what happened, assessed the situation, found a way to redirect it, that preserved Thomas's dignity and Crane's authority, and corrected the actual problem, and had done all of this without being asked and without announcing it. This man, she thought, was better at managing people than he let anyone believe. The question was, why he worked so hard to keep that invisible. She got part of her answer the following Sunday. The town of Crail was 11 miles east, and Ethan went in monthly for supplies and banking, and on the third Sunday of Claire's presence at the ranch, he told Martha she was going, and Martha told Claire, and Claire put on her better dress and climbed into the wagon without being invited, because she had decided that whatever Crail thought of Ethan Calloway's contract wife, she was going to find out sooner rather than later, and on her own terms. Ethan looked at her when she climbed up and said nothing, which she interpreted as acceptance. Crail was the size of a hard thought. Main Street, a bank, a general store, a church, a saloon, a doctor's office with a hand-painted sign. It had the particular feeling of a town where everyone knew everyone's business and did not consider this a problem. Several people looked up when the Calloway wagon came in, and Claire watched their eyes move from Ethan to her and felt the calculations happening in real time. That must be the one, the arrangement, the Whitmore girl, bankrupt family, the marriage that ain't really a marriage, saw it all move across their faces in quick succession. A woman named Agnes Heller was the first to say it out loud. She was standing outside the general store with 2 other women whose names Claire did not yet know, and she stepped forward as Ethan climbed down, and she looked at Claire with the specific smile of a woman who has decided to be kind in a way that is not actually kindness. "So you're the one," Agnes Heller said. "We'd heard Ethan had taken a wife, I suppose, is the word." "It is the word," Claire said pleasantly from the wagon seat. "Oh, Whitmore." Agnes continued, warming to it. Your father was the banker in Helena, wasn't he, before the well? Before everything. She paused with infinite delicacy. It must have been a difficult few years. The two women behind her were watching with the focused attention of people watching theater. Claire looked at Agnes Heller directly and smiled with great serenity. My father made some very poor decisions, she said. I've spent the last several years fixing them. I find it clarifying, actually. There's nothing like a crisis to show you exactly what you're capable of. She paused. Are you the Mrs. Heller who owns the dry goods on the east side? I was hoping to speak with you about fabric availability. Martha Doyle tells me you carry good quality broadcloth. Agnes blinked. She had expected either shame or defiance, and had gotten neither, and the conversational shift had moved faster than she'd anticipated. Yes, the east side, that's mine. Wonderful. I'll come in later in the week. Claire smiled again, and it was a smile that contained absolutely nothing aggressive and absolutely everything necessary. Lovely to meet you, Mrs. Heller. She climbed down from the wagon, and Ethan was beside her. She hadn't heard him come around, and he put his hand briefly at the small of her back as she stepped down, which was so unexpected that she almost stumbled, and she was quite certain it was not a romantic gesture, but a social one, a visible alignment. She's with me, step accordingly. And it worked because Agnes Heller stepped back half a pace and recalibrated the smile she was wearing. When they were far enough away, walking toward the bank, Ethan said quietly, Agnes Heller has talked about this ranch since Margaret died. She decides what the town thinks. I know what she is, Claire said. I grew up around women like her. You handled it well. I almost stumbled when you... She stopped. The gesture, with your hand. Did it help? She thought. Yes, she said honestly. It helped. He nodded and pushed open the bank door, and she followed him in, and she thought. He did that deliberately. He saw what was happening, and he intervened in the way most likely to work without making a scene. She thought about the fence crew and Thomas. She thought about how he'd handled Delaney in front of the whole crew, the sequence he'd chosen, the man he'd picked to take Delaney in. She thought, this man makes very few mistakes in public. Whatever is broken in him, it is not his judgment, which made her wonder not for the first time, and with increasing specificity, what exactly he was so afraid of. She got an answer she didn't expect on the ride home, when the sun was going down in layers of copper, and the road was quiet, and Thomas had fallen asleep in the wagon bed, almost before they'd cleared Crail's Main Street. Ethan said without looking at her, Hale's man was in town today. She turned her head. I'm sorry. Victor Hale, railroad investor. He's been pushing land acquisitions through this territory for 2 years. Ethan's voice was careful and flat, in the way of someone delivering information they've been sitting on for a while. He had a man at the bank, asking questions about the ranch's debt structure. The air in the wagon changed. What kind of questions? She said. The kind that mean he's looking for leverage. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. He's tried to buy this land twice. I've said no twice. After the second time, he started finding other methods. What other methods? Questioning the legal status of the co-ownership clause. The one that required... He paused. The one that required a wife of record. And there it was. The thing she hadn't been told, the piece she hadn't been given, the gap in the accounting that was not in any ledger, but was the largest number on the page. Claire sat with it for a moment, and felt several things simultaneously. A cold, practical anger, a kind of relieved clarity, because at least now the full picture was visible, and underneath both of those quieter something that felt uncomfortably like being used, though she was trying to decide if that was fair. The arrangement, she said, with the lawyer, the wife of record. Yes. This was not just administrative convenience. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. No, he said. It was that too. But primarily it was a legal defense, she said, against Hale's challenge to the co-ownership clause. Yes. Thomas shifted in the wagon bed behind them and settled again. The road was very quiet. You should have told me, Claire said. I know. I agreed to an arrangement. I agreed to the terms as I understood them. You changed the terms by not telling me the real stakes. I know, he said again, and there was something in it that was not quite an apology, but was in the vicinity of one. A man acknowledging he has done a thing that was expedient and not quite honest and is aware of the distinction. She looked at him in profile. The set jaw, the straight back, the hands on the reins that were careful and unhurried. And she thought about the debt and Thomas's schooling and the 6 months she'd signed to, and then she thought about Russ Delaney's scheme and Margaret's fire and an 11-year-old wound that had calcified into architecture. And she thought about what it cost a man like this to say "I know" twice in a row when he could simply have said nothing. "Victor Hale," she said finally. "Tell me everything you know about him." He looked at her then and quickly with surprise, and then something else. "You're not going to—" "I'm angry," she said. "I'll be angry for a while. But that doesn't change what's happening, and you telling me now means we have time to do something about it." She held his gaze. "Tell me about Hale." And there, barely visible, gone, almost before it registered, something crossed Ethan Calloway's face that she had not seen there before, in all the days she'd been at his ranch, in all the confrontations and silences and careful, measured words. Something that looked just for a moment like the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy alone for a very long time and has just been told he doesn't have to anymore. He turned back to the road. He started talking. And the wagon rolled on through the summer dark, and Thomas slept, and the ranch waited ahead of them in the distance, and somewhere 11 miles behind them, in the town of Crail. Victor Hale's man was still sitting in a bank asking questions that were going to need answering. Claire listened to every word Ethan said, and she did not interrupt, and she did not reassure him, and she did not waste a single syllable of what he was telling her. She was already building the response. Victor Hale, as it turned out, was not a man who announced himself. That was the first thing Ethan told her on the ride home. And it was the thing Claire thought about longest afterward, turning it over in the dark of her room, while the ranch settled around her, and the summer heat refused to release even in the small hours before dawn. Hale did not arrive with threats. He arrived with offers. Generous ones, reasonable ones, offers that came wrapped in the language of opportunity and progress, and the particular brand of civilized inevitability that men with railroad money had perfected in this territory. The railroad is coming regardless. The question is only whether you profit from it or get run over by it. He had made that offer to Ethan twice. The first time Ethan had said no, and Hale had nodded pleasantly and left. The second time Ethan had said no, and Hale had nodded pleasantly, left, and then 3 weeks later, a lawyer had filed a challenge to the co-ownership clause that governed Ethan's right to hold the eastern 40 acres that bordered the proposed rail route. The challenge was technical and specific, and written by someone who understood the original land grant document better than Ethan did, which meant Hale had obtained and studied that document, which meant the second visit had not been another offer. It had been reconnaissance. "He found the clause because my original partner wrote it badly," Ethan said, his voice flat in the dark of the wagon. "Silas meant it to protect the property if either of us died without heirs. But the language, the specific language, says, household in continuous marital operation, which Hale's lawyer is arguing means a household with a living married couple, and which my lawyer is arguing means an operating household, period." He paused. "After Margaret died, Hale's people found that language inside of 6 months. Your original lawyer should have closed that gap when you were widowed," Claire said. "He told me it wasn't a real exposure." "He was wrong." "Yes," Ethan said. "He was." Claire was quiet for a moment, assembling the sequence. "So when the banker proposed the arrangement to my father, the wife of record, in exchange for settling the debt, it was my idea," Ethan said. "Not his." He kept his eyes on the road. "I needed a name that was legal and credible, and attached to someone who wasn't going to expect—" He stopped. "Who wasn't going to expect it to be real," Claire said. "Yes." She sat with that for a long moment. The anger she'd named on the wagon was still there, banked low, a coal and not a fire. She had agreed to an arrangement. She had agreed to it with full information, she'd thought, and she had been wrong about that. And being wrong about the stakes of a thing you'd committed to was a particular kind of disorienting. But she also understood with the practical clarity that had gotten her through the last 3 years, that the stakes being larger than she'd known did not change the fact that she was already here, already committed, already 3 weeks into something that had its own momentum now. "He's going to come himself," she said. "Hale. He won't keep sending men if the proxy approach isn't working." "He'll come when he thinks he has enough leverage," Ethan said. "Then we need to make sure he doesn't get it." She turned to look at him. "Does anyone in town know the details of our arrangement? The specific terms? The banker, the lawyer. Can you trust them?" He thought about it. "The banker, yes. The lawyer." He paused. "Less certain." "Then we assume Hale knows the terms," Claire said. "Which means he knows this is a 6-month arrangement, which means he knows he only has to wait 5 more months and then the clause is exposed again," Ethan finished. "Yes, I know." The wagon rolled on. Thomas slept. The dark was full of insects and the far sound of the creek. "We need to look at the original land grant document," Claire said. "And the challenge filing. I want to read both." "Why?" "Because Hale's lawyer found something in the language that works for him. That means there may be something in the language that works for us that nobody's looked for yet." She paused. "Has anyone besides his lawyer actually read the challenge?" Ethan was quiet for 2 full seconds. "I have." "And your lawyer?" "He read Hale's summary of it." Claire turned to look at him directly. "Ethan, your lawyer read Hale's opponent's summary of a legal document and based his defense on that summary." The silence that followed had a particular quality. "I'll get you the documents tomorrow," Ethan said. "Please," said Claire. She spent the next 2 days reading. She was not a lawyer. She had no legal training beyond what her father's work had accidentally taught her: the language of contracts, the logic of clauses, the way a document could mean 2 different things, depending on where you put your emphasis. But she had a mind that was built for finding gaps, for noticing what was absent, for reading the space between the words and the words themselves simultaneously. And on the morning of the 3rd day, she found it. She brought it to Ethan at the kitchen table before breakfast, the document open in front of her, her finger on a specific phrase in the original land grant. "Here," she said. "The co-ownership clause says household in continuous marital operation. That's the language Hale's lawyer is using. But look at the sentence before it." Ethan leaned over the page. "For the purposes of this grant." Claire read, "Household shall be defined as any permanent domestic arrangement recognized under territorial law to include but not be limited to marital unions, legal partnerships, or custodial arrangements providing for the care of dependents." She looked up at him. "That's the definition." His lawyer is using the phrase in the clause without applying the definition that governs it. The grant itself defines household broadly. A marital union is one type. It is not the only type. Ethan stared at the page. "That's not a minor point," he said slowly. "No, it's the whole argument." She straightened. "If your lawyer files a motion to apply the definitional clause to the language, Hale's lawyer is using the challenge collapses. The marital requirement disappears because the grant itself says marriage is one option, not the requirement." He looked at her for a long moment. "You found this in 2 days." "I was looking for it," she said. "Your lawyer wasn't, because he thought the arrangement was the solution. He didn't think to look for a solution that made the arrangement irrelevant." He sat back. Something crossed his face, not quite wonder, not quite relief. Something that was the first cousin of both. Then it went somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't follow, and she watched him make that internal transition and waited. "Send for Dawson," he said finally. That was his lawyer's name, a man in Crail, who Claire had not yet met. "Today. I want him to see this before Hale moves again." "I'll write the message," Claire said. "I can write my own." "I'll write it," she said, "because I want to be precise about what he's looking at, and I'd like to attach my own notes." She held his gaze. "Unless you'd prefer to explain the definitional clause argument yourself." A beat. "Write the message," he said. She did. Dawson arrived the following afternoon and spent 45 minutes with the documents and Claire's notes. and when he came out of the office, his face had the particular expression of a man who has just realized he missed something significant and is deciding how to present that realization professionally. "This is yes," Dawson said with the careful precision of understatement. "This changes the filing considerably." "I'd think so," Claire said. Dawson looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man reassessing a piece of furniture that has started talking back. "Mrs. Calloway, where did you study?" "I didn't," she said. "I read." He looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing, which was a kind of answer. Dawson left with the documents and a clear set of instructions and the unmistakable air of a man going to do significantly more work than he'd planned on, and Martha brought coffee to the porch because she had apparently been listening through the kitchen window and had opinions about the timing of coffee, and the four of them. Martha, Thomas, Ethan, and Claire sat on the porch in the afternoon heat and didn't talk about what had just happened, which felt to Claire like a particular kind of quiet that was different from the quiets she'd sat in before. It felt like the quiet of people who are starting to trust each other's silences. Thomas destroyed the moment by saying, "So does this mean she's found the thing that stops Hale?" "It means she's found a legal argument," Ethan said. "Hale will counter it." "But it buys time." "It buys time," Claire said. "And it shifts the ground he's standing on. Right now he thinks he knows exactly what he's fighting. Now he has to recalculate." Thomas nodded with the focused satisfaction of a boy who likes chess, which was essentially what this was, and Martha refilled everyone's coffee without being asked, and Ethan looked out at the yard where the afternoon light was turning long and golden, and said nothing, but his shoulders were different than they'd been an hour ago. Slightly less weight. Not much, but some. Claire noticed, and she did not say so, and she thought, "Good. Let him have that." The accident happened on a Thursday, 8 days after Dawson's visit. Claire was in the house when she heard it. Not a crash, not a shout, but a particular kind of sudden silence from the direction of the east barn that was wrong in the specific way of a silence that follows something very bad. She was outside before she'd fully decided to move, crossing the yard at a pace that was nearly running, and she heard Holt's voice before she saw anything. "Get him clear, Morrison, don't move him, don't." A hand named Albright had been working the hayloft pulley system when the rope junction gave. He'd fallen 12 feet to the barn floor and landed wrong, and the way he was lying when Claire got to the barn door told her immediately that this was not a simple fall. The angle of his left arm was not an angle. An arm should be in, and he was conscious, but barely his face, the specific gray-white of someone in serious pain, trying very hard not to lose consciousness. 6 men were standing around him doing different versions of nothing useful. "All right," Claire said loudly enough to cut through the noise. "Everyone step back. Holt, find something flat aboard a door. Anything we need to move him without moving his spine. Morrison, go to the house and tell Martha I need the medical box, the one on the top shelf of the pantry. Move now." She was already crouching beside Albright, her hand light on his uninjured arm. "Albright, can you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said through his teeth. "Does your back hurt anywhere along your spine?" "My arm," he said. "I know. Does your back hurt?" He thought about it. "No, just no." "Good." She let out a breath. The arm was bad, possibly broken in 2 places, and there was a cut on his head that was bleeding. The way head wounds do dramatically, but probably not fatally. But the spine appeared intact, which meant they could move him safely, and the injury, horrible as it looked, was manageable. Holt appeared with a board. Claire directed the move, 3 men, specific positions her counting, and they got Albright flat on the board, and then flat on the ground in the shade outside the barn, and she was applying pressure to the head wound with her petticoat, which she'd torn without thinking about it when Ethan arrived. He took in the scene in one sweep and came to crouch beside her. "What happened?" "Rope junction failed on the loft pulley. He fell 12. Arm is broken, head wound, spine appears clear." She kept pressure on the cut. "He needs the doctor from Crail. Someone should ride now." "Jensen," Ethan said immediately, and Jensen was already moving before Ethan finished the word, because Jensen had clearly been waiting to be told what to do, and was glad to have a specific task. "The arm needs to be stabilized before he's moved again," Claire said. "Martha should have splinting material in the medical box." She paused. "Ethan, the rope junction. It didn't just fail." He looked at her sharply. Rope junctions wear through gradually, she said, keeping her voice low. You can see it happening if you look. A junction that fails without warning either wasn't inspected or it was helped, he said. Who had access to the east barn this morning? The question sat in the air between them. Ethan's jaw was very tight. He stood up and looked at the gathered crew, 12 men now watching with the combination of genuine concern and the specific alertness of people who know something larger is happening around a clear, immediate crisis. Who inspected the loft rigging this week? He said. Silence. Then Cooper said carefully, Delaney's crew always did the equipment checks. East Barn was their section. Delaney, who was in town waiting for a lawyer and who had friends still on the ranch. Ethan turned his head slowly and looked at two men standing at the back of the group. Men Claire had noticed before, as being apart from the others in some way she hadn't fully defined. They were both looking at the ground. Holt, Ethan said quietly. Take those two men off the property today. Don't explain it. Just take them to the road and tell them their employment here is done. Holt nodded once and moved. One of the two men looked up. You can't prove. I'm not proving anything, Ethan said. I'm running a ranch. Go. They went. Albright got to the doctor in 3 hours and came back with his arm set and his head stitched, and the doctor's prescription of 2 weeks of light work and whiskey for the pain, and the ranch absorbed the crisis. The way a ranch absorbs things, by continuing, by adjusting, by the people who remained picking up what needed picking up, and doing it without a great deal of discussion. That night, when Thomas was asleep, and Martha had gone to bed, and the house had gone quiet, Claire sat on the porch steps in the dark and let herself be tired, which she generally didn't permit herself to do in daylight. The summer night was warm, and the stars were enormous, and the ranch smelled like dust and cut grass and horses, and she sat there and breathed and let the last 12 hours move through her and settle. Ethan came out and sat beside her. Not close, but close enough to be deliberate. They were quiet for a while. You took charge, he said finally. Someone had to. Most people freeze. I've been freezing on the inside since I got here, she said. I find if I keep the outside moving, the inside catches up eventually. He looked at her sideways. The light was low enough that his expression was harder to read than usual, which she suspected he found more comfortable. You don't sleep like someone who fears this place, he said. She almost laughed. I sleep like someone who's exhausted from managing it. That's not the same as not fearing it. What are you afraid of? The question was quiet. Direct entirely without the usual armor, and it surprised her enough that she answered honestly before she could think about it. That I'll be here 6 months, and I'll leave, and everything I did here will be undone within a year, because I'm not here to hold it. She paused. And Thomas will be at school and proud of what I did, and I'll be somewhere else, starting over. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. You're afraid of it not lasting, he said. I'm afraid of doing good work that doesn't hold, she said. I've done that before, with my father. I kept the books, I found the gaps, I made the numbers work, and then he'd make 3 decisions in a week that undid all of it, and he never understood why I was angry, because he always thought the next decision would be different. He wasn't a bad man, Ethan said. Not a question, strangely. No, she said. He was a weak one, which is almost harder sometimes. He turned the water glass in his hands. He'd brought it out from the kitchen, and she waited. Margaret told me about the account irregularities on a Wednesday, he said. I told her I'd look at them Sunday. I was busy all week. He set the glass down on the step beside him. I never looked at them. The fire was on a Friday. Ethan, I'm not telling you because I need comfort, he said quickly but not harshly. I'm telling you because you said you're afraid of doing good work that doesn't hold. And I want you to understand that I know what that costs. I know what it costs when someone does the right thing and the person who should act doesn't act. He paused. I'm not that man anymore. Whatever I was that week, I'm not him now. Claire looked at him for a long moment. I believe you, she said. He looked at her, and in the low light of the Montana night, she could see something in his face that was not the sealed-off flatness she'd gotten used to. Not the gray-eyed measurement, not the careful armor. Something underneath it briefly visible like light under a door. Then it was gone. He stood up and said, Early start tomorrow. The doctor said Albright shouldn't work, but he'll try. Someone needs to tell him directly. I'll tell him, Claire said. He might not listen to you. He will, she said. He told me thank you today when the others weren't looking. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he went inside, and Claire sat a while longer in the dark, and she thought, he told me about Wednesday and Friday. He has never told that to anyone. I know because of the way he said it. Not practiced, not polished, not a story that's been told before. Raw. She thought, be careful, Claire. This is not your permanent life. This is 6 months, and a debt, and a legal arrangement, and a man who built himself around a wound. She thought all of these things with great clarity and great conviction, and she almost entirely believed them. Almost. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound. Not from inside the house, from the road. A horse moving at a pace that was too fast for this hour, slowing as it reached the gate. She stood up. The rider was Cal Jensen, who should have been in his bunk, and his face when he swung down from the saddle was the face of someone who has been riding hard with bad news for company. Jensen, she said. What happened? Rode into town for tobacco, he said, and he was catching his breath. Stopped at the saloon. Hale's man is there, not the same one as before, different one, and he's talking. Loud. About the ranch, about the arrangement. He stopped. Ma'am. He's saying the accident today wasn't an accident. He's saying it all over the saloon. But the way he's saying it, he's saying Calloway caused it. That Calloway cut the rope himself to get rid of Delaney's men and frame them. The world tilted slightly. He's putting Calloway at the center of it, Jensen said. Saying Calloway's been running a dangerous operation and covering it up with a fraudulent marriage to a woman who... He stopped. Who what? Claire said. Jensen looked at the ground. Who's been doctoring the book since she arrived? That's what he's saying. That the fraud wasn't Delaney, that you brought it in, that you and Calloway cooked it together. The silence that followed was enormous. Claire stood in it, and breathed through it, and felt it from the inside, with the specific quality of someone who has had the ground changed under them very quickly. Hale had not waited. He had not come himself. He had sent a man to a saloon to plant a story, a specific targeted story, and he had done it within 24 hours of the accident, which meant he'd known about the accident within 24 hours of it happening, which meant someone still on this ranch was reporting to him. Not Delaney's 2 men. Those had been too obvious. Someone else. Someone still here. Don't tell Calloway tonight, she said. Jensen looked up sharply. He's had a hard day, she said. He needs to sleep before he hears this, because if he hears it tonight, he'll want to ride into Crail and address it directly, and that's exactly what Hale wants, Calloway angry in public playing defense. She met Jensen's eyes. Tomorrow morning. Tell him everything you told me word for word. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. Good. She paused. Which saloon? The Lancer. And how many people were in there? 20 maybe. Some of them ranchers from the valley, the kind of men who vote on land council. Land council. Of course. Hale wasn't just making a story, he was making a story for the specific audience that had authority over the area land use decisions that would affect the rail route. This was not a rumor. This was a campaign. Thank you, Jensen, she said. Go to bed. Tomorrow. He went. She stood on the porch steps for a long time. She needed to know who the informant was. She needed to know before Ethan found out about the saloon story, because when he found out he was going to be angry, and angry men made mistakes about trust. And if he made a mistake about who he trusted at this particular moment, Hale would win without ever setting foot on the ranch. She needed to think. She went to Martha. Martha was, as Claire had suspected, not actually asleep. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with her Bible and a cup of chamomile, which she put down when Claire came in, and she looked at Claire's face and said, "What now?" Claire told her. Martha did not interrupt. She did not reach for dramatic reaction. She listened the way a woman listens when she's filing information against a map she's been building for a long time, placing each new fact against what she already knows and finding where it fits. When Claire finished, Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 3 weeks ago, a man came to see Holt, said he was Holt's cousin visiting from Miles City. He was here for 2 days. Was he? Claire said. Holt's cousin. Holt's from Ohio, Martha said. He doesn't have family in Miles City. She turned her teacup in her hands. I didn't say anything because I had no reason to, but the man spent a lot of time near the house, near the office. Near the office, Claire repeated. When I was working on the ledgers. Yes, the shape of it was becoming clear. Hale knew about the ledgers before we confronted Delaney, Claire said slowly. He knew because someone watched me build the case, and now he's using it, not just knowing it, but inverting it. Turning the evidence of Delaney's fraud into evidence of ours. A man who plans that well, Martha said, has been planning it for a while. Yes, Claire said. Which means he's not reacting to us. We're reacting to him. She looked at Martha directly. Holt, do you trust him? Martha considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, she said finally. I trust Holt. I don't think he knows who the cousin really was. All right. Claire stood up. Then tomorrow morning I need to talk to Holt before Jensen talks to Ethan. I need one thing verified before Ethan knows the full picture. What thing? The rope junction, Claire said. Holt was the one who did equipment checks before Delaney's crew took over. I want to know if he remembers the state of that junction in the east barn, the last time he inspected it, and when that was. Martha looked at her. If the junction was intact when Holt last saw it, then it was tampered with after Delaney's crew took over equipment checks, Claire said. Which means Delaney's people on the ranch, not Delaney himself, who was already in town, did it on instruction. And if they did it on Hale's instruction, then Hale's been coordinating with Delaney from the start, Martha said quietly. The fraud, the informant, the accident, all of it, Claire confirmed. Which means Russ Delaney is not a thieving supply manager. He's Hale's man. He was placed here. She paused. And Hale didn't need to wait for the co-ownership clause to expire. He was building a case from the inside, something that would compromise the ranch's legal standing, regardless of the marital arrangement. The kitchen was very quiet. He's patient, Martha said. Hale. Yes, Claire said. But patience has a shape. If you know what it's building toward, you can get there first. She picked up her lamp. Tell no one until I talk to Holt. Then we tell Ethan together, all three of us. Martha nodded. Then as Claire reached the kitchen door, she said, Margaret used to do this. Sit up at night working through a problem until she had the shape of it. She paused. I watched her do it 100 times. Claire stopped, turned. Martha looked at her with an expression that was complicated and layered, and ultimately arrived somewhere that wasn't quite peace, but was in the vicinity of it. I'm not saying you're her, Martha said. I'm saying the ranch has needed someone who sits up at night working on problems. It's been a long time. Claire stood in the doorway and didn't know quite what to say to that which was unusual for her. So she said nothing, just nodded and took her lamp and went back to her room. She did not sleep. She sat at her small desk with a piece of paper and a pencil and drew the whole picture out in the silence. Hale Delaney, the informant, the accident, the saloon story, the land council, the legal challenge, the definitional clause in the grant. Every moving piece, every connection, every pressure point. By the time the sky started to go pale with the first gray edge of dawn, she had a plan. It was not a safe plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It required Ethan's trust, Martha's help, Holt's information, and a confrontation with Hale that they were not yet positioned to win directly, but that they were positioned to survive, and surviving Hale long enough to expose him was the same as winning. She put her pencil down and looked at what she'd drawn. Then she heard from downstairs the specific sound of Ethan coming through the front door, which meant he'd had a tolerable night's sleep, and she stood up, gathered her papers, and went to meet him before Jensen could. She found him at the bottom of the stairs, and the look on his face when he saw her at this hour with her papers in her hand, and the particular expression she apparently wore when she'd been up all night building something told her he already knew something was coming. Sit down, she said. There's a great deal to tell you, and I need you to listen to all of it before you decide what you want to do. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down, and Claire Whitmore told Ethan Calloway the full truth about Victor Hale, Not the version Hale had spent 16 months building, but the version that Claire had assembled, piece by piece in the dark. The real version. The version that was going to require both of them to be smarter than they'd ever had to be for longer than either of them wanted. When she finished, Ethan sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been up all night." "Yes." "And you have a plan." "I have the beginning of one," she said honestly. "I need your knowledge of this territory to finish it." He looked at the papers in her hand, looked at her face, looked at something she couldn't name, something internal, some assessment happening behind those flat gray eyes that she'd learned over the past weeks was not absence, but depth. "All right," he said, and his voice this time was not the voice of a man who has decided to tolerate a woman's interference in his business. It was the voice of a man who has looked at the road ahead and recognized he is not equipped to walk it alone. It was a completely different thing, and Claire Whitmore, who had promised herself 6 months and a debt, and nothing more, felt something shift in her chest that she was not prepared for and could not immediately name, and she sat down across from Ethan Calloway and spread her papers on the table between them, and they began. The plan they built that morning had 4 parts and depended on 3 things going right that had no guarantee of going right. And Ethan told her this directly, and Claire said she knew, and they agreed on it anyway, because the alternative was waiting for Hale to finish what he'd started, and waiting was the one thing neither of them could afford. The first part was Holt. Holt confirmed at 6:30 in the morning, with his coffee untouched on the table in front of him, and his big hands folded with the stillness of a man delivering a statement. He knows matters that the last time he had personally inspected the East Barn Loft rigging was 3 months prior, when Delaney's crew had taken over equipment checks. He remembered the junction clearly. It had been sound. New rope properly knotted nowhere. He would swear to it. "Would you swear to it in front of a county assessor?" Claire asked. Holt looked at her across the table. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I would." "Good," she said. "You may need to." The second part was Dawson. Ethan rode to Crail himself that afternoon, and came back with Dawson, who listened to everything: the saloon story, the informant theory, the Delaney as Hale's man hypothesis, and Claire's account of the timeline, with the focused attention of a man rapidly recalculating the scope of what he'd agreed to handle. When it was finished, Dawson took off his glasses and cleaned them with his sleeve, and said, "If what you're describing is accurate, Hale has been running a coordinated land acquisition scheme across at least 3 properties in this territory." "Is that relevant legally?" Claire asked. "It's relevant because it means we're not looking at a single challenger with a single claim," Dawson said. "We're looking at a pattern of conduct, and patterns of conduct documented properly can be brought before a territorial judge as evidence of fraud, rather than simply contested at the contract level." He put his glasses back on. "The legal argument you found in the grant document is strong. Combined with a demonstrated pattern of fraudulent interference, if we can document it, it becomes considerably stronger." "How do we document it?" Ethan said. "The other properties he's targeted," Claire said before Dawson could answer. "We need to talk to them, the owners. Find out if Delaney appeared at any of them. If someone who looked like the cousin from Miles City appeared at any of them. If false accounting appeared at any of them." Dawson looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said with the expression of a man who keeps being surprised by the same person and has not yet finished being surprised. "I'll reach out," Ethan said. "I know the Hayes family in the North Valley, and the Brennan operation east of Crail." He paused. "If they've seen the same pattern, then we're not defending a contract," Claire said. "We're building a case." The third part of the plan was time. They needed 2 weeks minimum to gather what Dawson required. 2 weeks during which Hale's saloon story would spread, during which the land council members would be hearing one version of events, during which the social fabric of Crail would be slowly repositioned against the Calloway name by a man who understood very precisely how much damage reputation damage could do to a ranch's operating contracts and supply relationships. They had exactly 1 week before Hale arrived himself. He came on a Tuesday at mid-morning in a carriage that was not showy, but was expensive in the specific way of things that don't need to announce their cost, because the cost is apparent regardless. He was younger than Claire had imagined, late 40s perhaps, with a pleasant face that reminded her immediately and uncomfortably of Russ Delaney, because it had the same quality of being assembled for an audience, rather than reflecting anything underneath it. He dressed like a city man who had spent time learning how to dress like a man who doesn't need to dress like a city man, which put him in a particular category that Claire recognized from her father's banking world. The category of men who perform approachability while conducting business that is anything but. He came through the front gate, and Ethan met him in the yard, and Claire stood on the porch and watched. "Calloway," Hale said, stepping down from the carriage and extending his hand with a smile that was perfectly calibrated. "It's been too long." Ethan shook the hand the way you shake the hand of a man you'd rather not touch. "Hale, I hope you don't mind. I was in the territory on other business and thought I'd stop by. Neighborly." Hale's eyes moved to Claire on the porch. "This must be your wife." "Yes," Ethan said. Hale smiled at her. It was a warm smile, a genuine seeming smile, and it made the back of Claire's neck cold because she knew exactly what was behind it. "Mrs. Calloway, I've heard a great deal about you." "I imagine you have," she said pleasantly. "Won't you come in?" It was not a question. They sat in the parlor. Ethan and Claire on one side of the room, Hale on the other. Martha appearing briefly with coffee she hadn't been asked to make, which told Claire that Martha had been listening from the kitchen and had opinions about maintaining the social form of the encounter. Martha's opinions were generally correct, and the coffee gave everyone hands to do something with which mattered when what was actually happening in the room was nothing like what appeared to be happening. Hale made small talk with the ease of a man who has perfected small talk into a weapon. He asked about the ranch's summer production. He expressed sympathy about the accident in the East Barn, which told them he had information faster than the stage could carry it. He mentioned that he'd heard Claire was originally from Helena, which told them he'd had her background researched before she arrived, which meant he'd known about the arrangement before it was publicly known. Every pleasantry was a message. Ethan received them in flat silence. Claire received them in matching pleasantry because she'd decided before he arrived that her role in this conversation was to make him uncertain about how much they knew, and uncertainty in a man like Hale was the most useful condition to create. Then Hale set down his coffee and said with the tone of a man shifting from social mode to business mode, that was itself entirely rehearsed. "I'll be honest with you, Ethan, because I respect you. The legal challenge on the co-ownership clause. I didn't want it to go that direction. My lawyer advised it. But I wonder now if a direct conversation might accomplish more." "What kind of direct conversation?" Ethan said. "The eastern 40 acres, Hale said. "That's all I need. The rail route requires it. The survey is done. The alignment is fixed. I'm not interested in the rest of your operation. I've never been interested in the rest of your operation. If you sell me those 40 acres at fair market value, plus a percentage of the rail contract revenue." "No," Ethan said. Hale paused one beat, absorbing this with the practiced patience of a man who expected it. "Ethan, the eastern 40 borders the water access for the North Pasture," Ethan said. "You know that. Selling it doesn't just lose 40 acres, it loses the water rights that go with it. Without the North Pasture, I can't run the herd that makes this operation viable. You're not asking me to sell 40 acres. You're asking me to sell the ranch's operating capacity for the price of 40 acres. The water rights can be negotiated separately. They travel with the land under territorial law," Claire said. Hale looked at her. His smile stayed exactly where it was. "Mrs. Calloway, you've been studying." "I read," she said with the same tone she'd used with Dawson. "Mr. Hale, the water rights are appurtenant to the eastern parcel under the original grant. They don't separate by negotiation. They separate by a new grant application, which requires territorial review and takes 18 months minimum. You know this. Your lawyer knows this." She held his gaze pleasantly. "So the question isn't whether you can negotiate the water rights separately. The question is what you're actually offering, which is substantially less than fair market value once the water access loss is calculated." The room was very quiet. Hale looked at her for a moment with an expression that had changed not much, not visibly, but Claire saw it, the micro-adjustment behind the pleasant face, the recalibration. He had not expected her to know the water rights structure. He had expected Ethan to be defending on the grounds of sentiment, which is much easier to work around than the grounds of legal fact. "You've hired yourself good help," Hale said to Ethan lightly. "She's my wife," Ethan said. "Not help." Another recalibration faster this time. "Of course." Hale picked up his coffee. "I'll have my lawyer send revised terms. I think there's room to structure this in a way that serves everyone." "There may not be," Claire said, "but we'll read whatever you send." He left 20 minutes later, smooth as he'd arrived, and the carriage went back down the road, and Claire stood on the porch watching it go, and felt Ethan beside her without looking at him. "He'll be at the land council meeting on Friday," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "And now he knows we know more than he thought. He's going to move faster." "How much faster?" "Before Friday," she said. "Something will happen before Friday." She was right, but not in the way she'd expected. What happened was Thomas. He came to her room on Wednesday night, late after the house had gone quiet, and knocked with a particular knock that he'd used since childhood to mean this is serious, and I didn't know who else to come to, and Claire opened the door and took one look at his face and stepped back to let him in. "I talked to someone in town today," he said, "when Holt took me in for supplies." "Who?" "Man named Garrett. Works at the Lancer Saloon. He found me on the street, said he knew who I was, said he'd been hearing things." Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed his hands together the way he did when he was working through something hard. "Claire," he said, "Hale's lawyer filed a new document yesterday. Not about the co-ownership clause." "What about the arrangement itself?" Thomas looked at her. "He filed an affidavit, signed by Russ Delaney, stating that the marriage between you and Calloway is a documented contractual arrangement entered into for the purpose of deceiving a legal challenge, and that as a documented arrangement, it does not constitute a valid marital union under territorial law, and that therefore the co-ownership clause cannot be satisfied by it," Claire said. "Yes." She sat down. She put both hands flat on the desk in front of her and breathed. Delaney, from wherever he was waiting for his lawyer, had signed a statement. He had done it knowing it would likely destroy his own legal defense. Signing an affidavit that admitted he had inside knowledge of the arrangement's terms meant admitting he'd had access to private legal documents, which was not a clean admission for a man already facing fraud charges. Which meant Hale had made it worth his while to do it anyway. Which meant Hale had offered Delaney something significant enough that Delaney had decided the fraud charges were a smaller problem. "He's moving up the timeline," she said quietly. "He doesn't want to wait for the land council. He wants this filed and in front of a judge before Friday." Thomas watched her. "What does it mean for you if the judge accepts it?" She looked at her brother. She thought about the debt, about the arrangement, about Dawson's argument, and the definitional clause, and the case they'd been building. She thought about Ethan, about Martha, about Holt and Jensen and Albright and Cooper, about a ranch that had been bleeding quietly for 16 months and had finally stopped, about a man who had finally this morning started using the front door more than the side. "It means," she said, "that we stop building the defense and we go on offense, right now." She stood up. "Go get Ethan." "It's almost midnight." "Thomas, go get Ethan." He went. Ethan came in his shirt sleeves with his hair not entirely in order and his eyes fully alert, because he was the kind of man who came awake fast and complete, and he listened to everything Thomas had reported without interruption. And when it was finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "We need Dawson tonight." "Dawson's in Crail," Thomas said. "Jensen can ride," Ethan said, and was already moving to the door. "Ethan." Claire's voice stopped him. He turned. She said, "Before Dawson, before any of this, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." He looked at her. "Delaney's affidavit is accurate," she said. "The arrangement is real. The contract exists. If this goes in front of a judge and the judge decides the definitional clause argument isn't enough, if Hale wins the legal challenge, you lose the 40 acres and possibly more." She paused. "I can't guarantee Dawson's argument wins. I found the language, I believe in it, but I can't guarantee it." She held his gaze. "If you want to offer Hale the 40 acres tonight before this goes to a judge, I will understand it. It is your land and your ranch and your decision." The room was very still. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Do you think the argument wins? He said. Yes, she said. I think it wins, but I'm not infallible. Neither is Hale, he said. And he's had 2 years and a lawyer and an inside man, and he still hasn't taken this ranch. He turned back to the door. Jensen rides tonight. Thomas, go back to bed, you've done your part. He glanced back at Claire. You too. Sleep if you can. I can't. I know. A pause, his hand on the doorframe. Then come down and help me write the brief for Dawson. She came down and helped him write the brief, and they sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, with the lamp between them and the ranch quiet outside. And somewhere around midnight, Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, despite being told to go to bed, and Martha appeared 10 minutes after that, with food nobody had asked for, and the 4 of them were still at that table when Jensen got back from Crail at 2:30, with Dawson in tow, and Dawson read the brief and Claire's notes and said 2 things. This is serious, and I think we can beat it. In that order. With complete conviction on both counts. Friday came the way hard things come, inevitable, fully present, not a moment early, and not a moment late. The Land Council meeting was held in the Crail Assembly Hall, which was a generous name for a room above the general store, with 23 chairs and a dais that had seen better days, and it was full by the time the Calloway party arrived. Ethan, Claire, Dawson, and Holt, who had insisted on coming, and whom nobody had argued with, because Holt, at 6'2", with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, was a particular kind of social statement. Hale was already there. He had a lawyer beside him, not the one who'd filed the original challenge, a new one, sharper looking with the specific energy of someone who has been briefed extensively and is confident in his material. He nodded at Ethan when they came in with the nod of a man who has already decided how this ends. The council chairman was a man named Birch, 60 years old, Montana weathered, with the expression of someone who has been managing other people's disputes his entire adult life and finds them all roughly equivalent in tedium and importance. He called the meeting to order, explained the matter before them, the Hale legal challenge, the Calloway defense, the Delaney affidavit, and invited Hale's lawyer to speak first. Hale's lawyer spoke for 12 minutes. He was good. He was precise, structured, and he had clearly anticipated Dawson's definitional clause argument, because he addressed it proactively, arguing that a definitional clause providing alternatives did not negate the specific language of the operative clause, which required a household in continuous marital operation, and that the Delaney affidavit established the marriage as a documented arrangement rather than a genuine marital union, and therefore, point of inquiry, Claire said. Birch looked at her. The room looked at her. Hale's lawyer stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. Ma'am, Birch said carefully. I apologize for the interruption, Claire said from her seat, which she had chosen deliberately in the middle of the row, not at the back. But counsel has just stated that the Delaney affidavit establishes the marriage as a documented arrangement. I'd like to ask on what basis Russ Delaney has standing to characterize the nature of our marriage. He is not a party to it. He is not a witness to it. He is a former employee currently facing fraud charges, filing an affidavit at the direction of a man with a direct financial interest in the outcome of this proceeding. She looked at Hale's lawyer calmly. Is that the quality of testimony this counsel intends to rely on? The room was not quiet. Several of the ranchers shifted. 2 of them looked at each other. Birch said nothing, which was itself a response. Hale's lawyer recalibrated. He said, the affidavit speaks to the documented existence of a prior contractual arrangement. All marriages involve prior contractual arrangements, Claire said. That's what a marriage contract is. She looked at Birch. Mr. Chairman, if counsel is arguing that the existence of a contract prior to a marriage negates the validity of that marriage, I would ask him to explain how every marriage in this territory that involved a pre-arranged agreement, which is most of them, is also invalid. Because that argument does not narrow to our situation. It applies broadly. Someone in the room laughed short and quickly suppressed. Hale's lawyer looked at Hale. Hale's face was very still. Dawson stood up and made the definitional clause argument cleanly and fully, and cited 3 comparable cases from territorial law, where similar language had been adjudicated in favor of the broader definition. And when he sat down, the room was different than it had been when he stood up. Then Hale stood up himself. This was not planned. His lawyer reached out a hand, and Hale moved past it smoothly, because Hale had decided that the proceeding had shifted somewhere he hadn't intended, and was adjusting in real time. And that adjustment took the form of abandoning the legal argument and going directly for the social one, the one that was actually what the saloon story had been building toward. "I want to speak to this council as neighbors," Hale said, and his voice was warm and measured and utterly controlled. "Not as a legal matter, as a community matter." He looked around the room. "This territory is growing. The railroad brings connections, commerce, opportunity. I am not the villain in this story. I am a man trying to build something that benefits everyone in this room." His gaze landed on Claire. "And I will say with respect that a woman who arrived at this ranch 6 weeks ago on a debt settlement arrangement, who has since inserted herself into its legal, financial, and now public affairs. A woman whose father's bankruptcy destroyed the savings of 11 Helena families." "Stop!" Ethan said. His voice was not loud. It was very, very quiet, and it cut through Hale's pleasant, measured tone, the way a knife cuts through something that was pretending to be solid. Ethan stood up. "You're talking about my wife," he said. "I'm talking about the circumstances." "You're talking about her father's failures as though they're hers," Ethan said. "You're talking about the terms of our arrangement as though you have any standing to characterize it. You're standing in front of this council, trying to use the name of a woman you don't know and have never spoken an honest word to discredit a legal argument you couldn't defeat on its merits." He looked at Hale directly. "I know what you are. This council is starting to know what you are. And I'd advise you to finish your legal presentation and sit down." Hale looked at him. That pleasant face was very still. "Calloway." "Sit down," Ethan said. Hale sat. And in that moment, that specific charged electric moment, Claire felt something that she'd been carefully not feeling for 6 weeks, break through every rational barrier she'd constructed. Not gratitude, not relief. Something deeper and less manageable, something that had been building in the small hours, and the kitchen table, and the porch steps, and the careful distances they kept, and the names they'd started using without thinking, and the hands flat on desks, and the looks exchanged over other people's heads. She sat very still, and breathed, and looked at the dais, and did not look at Ethan. Birch called the session to a recess for deliberation. People moved around the room in clusters, ranchers talking. Dawson talking quietly to 2 of the council members, Holt standing like a statue near the door, with the specific presence of a man who is making a statement without saying anything. Hale crossed the room to Claire. She saw him coming and stayed in her chair. "A marriage born of convenience has no legal soul," Hale said quietly just to her. "Whatever argument your lawyer makes about definitions, whatever speech your husband makes about respect, I know what this is, and eventually this council will know, and eventually this territory will know. You cannot hold a thing together with legal language and a good poker face." Claire looked up at him. "You're afraid?" she said. He blinked. "Just once, but it was there. You've been running this scheme for 2 years, and you thought it was contained," she said, her voice perfectly level. "And then a woman showed up who found your inside man in 6 days, identified your legal exposure in 2 days, and just told a room full of ranchers why your star witness has no standing." She held his gaze. "You came over here because you thought you could frighten me. That tells me you're out of moves." Hale said nothing. His face was very, very controlled. "Go back to your lawyer," she said. "Whatever the council decides today, there are things coming that you aren't prepared for. And unlike you, Mr. Hale, I don't bluff." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back across the room, and Claire let out a breath so carefully that no one would have seen it, and she pressed her hands flat on her knees to keep them from shaking, because they were shaking, and she was not going to let anyone in this room see that. She felt Ethan sit down beside her. Not where he'd been sitting before. Closer. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But under the table, without looking at her, he reached over and put one hand briefly over both of hers, large and warm and very steady, and she felt the shaking stop. She looked straight ahead. Birch came back. The council members filed back to their seats. And then Birch said something that made Hale's lawyer go very still. "Before we deliver our assessment," Birch said, The council has a question for Mr. Hale, specifically regarding a prior challenge filed by his legal representative against the Brennan property in 1882 and a separate challenge against the Hayes operation in 1881. He looked at Hale over his glasses, both of which used similar legal language to the current challenge, and both of which involved former employees of those properties later found to have been engaged in financial misconduct. The room went very quiet. The Hayes and Brennan families were in the room. Claire saw both of them seated in the back row, and she understood immediately that Ethan had not simply reached out to them for information. He had reached out to them, and they had come, and they were here, and nobody had told Hale. Hale looked at the back row. He looked at Birch. He looked at his lawyer. His lawyer said very quietly, "Victor." "I'd like a recess," Hale said. "The council is not in recess," Birch said. "The council would like to hear your answer." And Claire Whitmore, sitting in the middle of a row in a room above a general store in a town called Crail, on a Friday afternoon in a summer that had turned out to be nothing like what she'd signed up for, felt something settle into place. Not victory, not yet. They weren't there yet, but the precise, unmistakable sense of the ground shifting under the right person's feet. She thought, "We have him. Not today, but we have him." She thought, "Don't show it. Not yet." She looked straight ahead and kept her face perfectly composed, and under the table she turned her hands over and held Ethan's hand back. Neither of them acknowledged it. Neither of them let go. Hale asked for a recess twice more. Birch denied him both times with the particular patience of a man who has seen delay tactics before and has decided today is not the day for them. What followed was not dramatic in the way of novels. It was the quieter, more devastating drama of a man being required to answer questions in sequence in public without the time to construct the architecture of a good lie. Hale's lawyer tried twice to redirect, citing procedural concerns, citing relevance, and Dawson addressed both objections with the focused efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this and was glad to finally use it. The Hayes family had documents. Samuel Hayes, 58 years old, stood up from the back row when Birch invited him to speak and described in plain, unhurried language a challenge filed against his North Pasture water rights in 1881, a challenge that had appeared 2 months after a man named Cole Whitfield had been employed as his supply manager and terminated for inflating invoices. Cole Whitfield, Samuel Hayes said, had signed an affidavit in support of Hale's challenge to his property. The challenge had ultimately failed, but not before Hayes had spent 8 months and money he didn't have defending it. Maggie Brennan was younger than Claire expected. Early 40s, sharp-eyed with the specific economy of motion of a woman who runs an operation alone. She stood up without being invited because she had apparently decided that waiting to be invited was taking too long, and said that in 1882, a man named Aldous Pryor had been employed on her operation for 5 months before being dismissed for doctoring the grain weight records. 3 weeks after his dismissal, Hale's lawyer had filed a challenge to her eastern boundary claim. That challenge had also failed, but the legal costs had forced her to defer 3 years of fence maintenance that she was still catching up on. The room was very quiet when Maggie Brennan sat down. Birch looked at Hale. "Mr. Hale," he said, 3 properties, 3 former employees with financial misconduct, 3 legal challenges. Do you have an explanation for this, counsel?" Hale was very still. His pleasant face had not broken. It was still there, still assembled, but the assembly was effortful now in a way it hadn't been 2 hours ago, and everyone in the room could see the effort because they were all looking for it. "These are coincidences," Hale said. "Unfortunate ones. I cannot control who makes claims on their behalf." "Cole Whitfield currently works for your Denver office," Dawson said from his seat. "I have his employment record. He was hired 11 days after the Hayes challenge was filed." He paused. "Aldous Pryor is currently employed by your land acquisition subsidiary in Billings. He was hired 17 days after the Brennan challenge was filed." Another pause. "And Russ Delaney, who filed the affidavit against the Callaway property, has been promised a position with your rail contracting firm in exchange for his cooperation. I have a letter confirming that offer signed by your legal representative, which was intercepted." "Intercepted," Hale said sharply. and it was the first time his voice had moved out of its careful register. Provided, Dawson corrected smoothly, by Delaney himself, who it turns out became considerably more cooperative when he understood that the fraud charges he's currently facing carry a heavier sentence than the affidavit cooperation you offered him credit for. The room broke into noise. Not chaos, the controlled noise of ranchers who have been sitting still with something large, and they've just been given permission to react to it. Birch brought the session back to order with 2 knocks of his gavel and the expression of a man who is going to take exactly as long as he needs to, and not a moment longer. Claire sat very still and watched Hale. She watched him do the calculation, watched him assess the room, the documents, the 3 families, Dawson, the gavel, the specific weight of what had just been laid out, and she watched him arrive at the place. All such men eventually arrive when the scaffolding comes down around them. Not remorse, not admission. The cold, practiced pivot toward damage control. "I'd like to speak to my lawyer," Hale said. "You're welcome to do so," Birch said. "The council will deliver its assessment in 20 minutes regardless." Hale and his lawyer moved to the far corner of the room, and their conversation was quiet and brief, and ended with Hale straightening his jacket, and his lawyer putting papers back in his case with the specific efficiency of a man packing up to leave. Ethan leaned slightly toward Claire. "He's going to withdraw the challenge," he said very low. "Before the council rules against him," she said equally low, "so he can claim he withdrew voluntarily rather than being defeated." "Does it matter?" She thought about it. "It matters to him," she said. "It doesn't matter to us. The outcome is the same." Hale crossed back to the dais and said, with the composure of a man who has decided that composure is the last thing he can control, that in light of the information presented today, he was withdrawing the legal challenge pending a review of the documentation by his office. He said it without looking at the Hayes or Brennan families. He said it without looking at Claire. He said it looking at a point slightly above Birch's head, and his voice was level, and there was nothing in it at all. Birch received the withdrawal with a nod that conveyed without words that the council would be watching future activity in this territory with considerably more attention than it had previously. He adjourned the session. Hale left without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed. The carriage was gone before the assembly hall had emptied. Samuel Hayes shook Ethan's hand. Maggie Brennan shook Claire's hand, which Claire hadn't expected, and looked at her with the direct assessing gaze of a woman who has run her own operation for long enough to know exactly what she's looking at. "Good work," Maggie Brennan said. "You too," Claire said. "Both of you. Coming here mattered. Ethan wrote to us," Maggie said. "Told us what was happening. First time in 4 years anyone told us what was happening to them instead of waiting to see if it happened to them too." She paused. "You've done this ranch some good." She walked away before Claire could answer, which was probably for the best, because Claire wasn't entirely sure what she would have said. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Thomas had come into town for the session and rode back with them, and he spent most of the ride in a visible state of restrained excitement that he was clearly trying to manage into something more dignified and occasionally failing. He kept catching Claire's eye, and she kept looking at him steadily until he reeled it back in. About 4 miles from the ranch, Ethan said without preamble, "Delaney." He turned because Dawson got to him. "Dawson and I wrote a letter 2 weeks ago," Claire said, laying out his exposure on the fraud charges and comparing it to what Hale was offering him. The math was not complicated. She paused. "I had Dawson sit on it. I wasn't sure we'd need it." Ethan looked at her. "You wrote it 2 weeks ago. When we built the plan, it was the 4th part. You told me there were 3 parts. I told you the plan had 3 parts I needed your help with," she said. "The 4th part I could handle myself." He looked at her for another moment. Something in his expression was not amused, not quite, but in the family of it. The shadow of something she'd seen occasionally at the corner of his mouth present, and not suppressed. "Next time," he said, "all 4 parts." "Yes," she said. "All right." Thomas very carefully looked out the other side of the wagon. Martha had supper ready when they arrived. A real supper, the kind that required effort and planning, and the specific statement of someone who had been confident enough in the outcome to start cooking before anyone came home with news. She didn't ask what happened. She looked at their faces and nodded once and put food on the table. They ate together, all four of them in the dining room, and it was the first meal that felt like something other than coexistence. Thomas talked about the council session, about Samuel Hayes, about Maggie Brennan, whom he'd apparently found formidable and fascinating, and Martha listened and occasionally corrected his impressions of the town's history, and Ethan said little but ate a full plate, which Martha later told Claire was more than he'd managed at a meal in several months. After Thomas helped Martha clear something he'd started doing on his own, somewhere in the second week, which Martha had initially resisted and eventually accepted with the specific grace of a woman who has decided to stop fighting things that aren't worth fighting. And Claire stood on the porch in the summer evening and thought, "This is the part where I should feel settled. This is the part where the hard thing is over and the rest is manageable." She did not feel settled. She felt something considerably more complicated, and she was trying to decide what to do with it. Ethan came out and stood beside her. The yard was quiet. The light was the particular deep gold of a summer evening that has nothing left to prove. Somewhere in the south field, Holt's crew was doing something that made a rhythmic sound she couldn't identify, and the horses in the near pasture moved with the lazy ease of animals at the end of a day that asked nothing of them. "Dawson will file the counterclaim on the land grant next week," Ethan said. "It should close the challenge permanently." "Yes. And the Hayes and Brennan families, he'll put together a territorial complaint. With the 3 properties documented, the pattern is clear enough for a formal review of Hale's conduct." "Yes," she said again. Howe was quiet for a moment. "You should know the debt is cleared," he said. "Formally, as of the withdrawal. The bank consideration was contingent on resolution of the challenge, and the challenge is withdrawn. The arrangement." He paused. "The 6 months. It's not you're not obligated to the full term. The legal necessity is resolved." She turned her head and looked at him. Howe was looking at the yard, not at her, and his jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was saying something that cost him. "Ethan," she said. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said quickly, and then stopped as though surprised by his own quickness. She looked at him. He looked at the yard. The evening light was on his face, and she thought not for the first time, and more clearly than before, that this was a man who had been alone with his damage for so long that the idea of it being otherwise required a vocabulary he'd never had occasion to develop. "If you want me to go," she said carefully, "I will. Thomas's schooling is secured, the debt is cleared, I have what I came for, and I know it." She paused. "But if you're telling me the arrangement is resolved because you're trying to give me permission to stay without having to ask me to, I would rather you just ask me." The yard was very quiet. "Don't do that," he said low. "Do what?" "Make it simple," he said. "You make everything you see the thing under the thing, and you name it, and it's very difficult to—" He stopped. Exhaled. "I built my life on losing people before they left," he said. And it was the same sentence he'd said in the office weeks ago, but said differently now, said with the specific rawness of someone who has finally run out of ways to not say the real thing. "Margaret. My partner. The hands who've come and gone. Every person I let close enough to matter." He looked at her then. Full-on gray eyes without armor. I don't know what this is. What you are. I know what you were when you arrived, and I know it's not what you are now, and I don't have language for what's in between." "Yes, you do," she said. He looked at her. "You have the language," she said. "You're just afraid of what it costs to use it." He was very still. "Then stop living," she said, her voice very quiet, "like I've already gone." The silence that followed was the largest thing that had ever been in the space between two people in Claire Whitmore's life. It was larger than the council room. It was larger than the ranch, and the debt, and the 6 months, and the document she'd signed in a lawyer's office with steady hands and a closed heart. Ethan Calloway looked at her, and something that had been sealed for 11 years broke, not loudly, not dramatically. The way a door breaks when it's been held shut against pressure for so long that when the pressure finally releases, it doesn't crash open, it just opens. Quietly. Completely. He reached out and put his hand against her face. One hand his thumb at her cheekbone, and looked at her with an expression she had no name for, because she had never seen it on his face before, had never seen it in its full form, only in fragments and echoes and the shadows of it at the corners of a mouth that rarely smiled. She put her hand over his and held it there. "Stay," he said, the single word. Undecorated, unstrategic, entirely without the careful armor she'd watched him wear for 6 weeks. Just the word. Just the ask. "Yes," she said. Obviously yes. Something moved through him. Not tears, not collapse, none of the theatrical release of men in stories. Just a long exhale and a slight loosening of the set of his shoulders that she understood after 6 weeks of reading him meant more than most people's declarations. He said after a moment, "I didn't buy a wife." She looked at him. "I put a name on a contract," he said, "because I was afraid, and I needed a legal solution, and I didn't know what was going to walk through that door." He looked at her steadily. "I met the only person who ever stayed when she had every reason not to." Claire stood in the summer evening and thought about 3 years of fixing her father's failures and boarding a stage to a ranch she'd never seen, and a man she'd never met, and signing a document with steady hands and a closed heart. She thought about ledgers and delivery confirmations, and a lawyer who finally read the right language, and a room full of ranchers who finally heard the right truth. She thought about midnight kitchens and whiskey for Albright, and a boy named Thomas, who had apparently learned to do dishes somewhere between a bankrupt family and a Montana cattle ranch. She thought, "I came here to survive. I didn't expect to find something worth staying for." She said, "I came here with a debt and a brother and 6 months and no intention of anything beyond that." She held his gaze. "I'm still here. Make of that what you will." His mouth moved. It was a smile. A real one, full and unguarded, and she'd wondered what it would look like, and the answer was that it changed his entire face, not into someone else, but into the same person, without the weight. And the weight had been considerable, and without it, he looked like a man who had just put down something very heavy and discovered he still remembered how to stand straight. "Martha's going to be insufferable," he said. "Martha has been insufferable since day 3, Claire said. "I think she's earned it." He laughed. Short, quiet, genuine, the laugh of a man who has not laughed in a long time and is slightly surprised by the experience. And Claire thought, there it is. There is the person who was under all of it, inside the house. Thomas said something that made Martha make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood, and the summer evening held them all in the specific grace of a day that has done what it needed to do and is not asking anything more. Ethan dropped his hand from her face, but did not step away. "The ranch needs a lot of work," he said, and his voice was different now. Not the flat, controlled register she'd learned to read, but something warmer, something that still belonged to a man who chose words carefully, but was no longer choosing them for protection. "The north fence needs replacing before winter. The east barn rigging has to be inspected and redone. I want to talk to Dawson about a proper water rights registration before anything else tries to challenge it." He paused. "And I'd like someone who's good with numbers to look at the operating budget for next year." "I imagine you would," Claire said. "I imagine I would too," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. "You know this isn't going to be simple," she said. Hale withdrew the challenge. He didn't concede. A man like that doesn't walk away because he lost one council session. "No," Ethan said. "He'll regroup, find another angle. We'll need to keep Dawson close and maintain the connection with Hayes and Brennan. If Hale moves on any of the 3 properties now, he moves on all of us simultaneously." She paused. "And the informant. We still don't know for certain who reported to Hale." "Cooper thinks it was a man named Garrett," Ethan said. "The one who told Thomas." She stopped. "Garrett from the Lancer Saloon. Works for Hale," Ethan said. "Has for 3 years. He gave Thomas the information because Hale wanted us rattled before the session. The warning was the move, not the kindness." He looked at her. "I found out this morning. I was going to tell you after." She stood with that for a moment, the shape of it, a warning engineered to look like help, designed to rattle rather than inform. "He's very good," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "And now he knows we're better." A pause. "Together." The word landed between them simply and without performance, and Claire let it land and did not reach for it, or qualify it, or fold it into something smaller than it was. Together. 6 weeks ago, she'd signed a contract in a lawyer's office and counted 6 months like a sentence to be served. She had found fraud in the ledgers and a language gap in the land grant and a pattern of manipulation that ran across 3 properties and 2 years. She had held Ethan Calloway's hand under a table in a room full of ranchers and felt the shaking stop. She had sat at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning and built a case that dismantled a man who thought he had already won. She had not planned any of it. She had planned to survive it and leave clean. The best thing she was learning rarely went according to the plan. Holt came across the yard from the south field and tipped his hat at both of them. A small gesture, unhurried, containing more in it than a man like Holt would ever say out loud. Cooper was behind him, and Cooper nodded. Jensen appeared from the direction of the barn and raised a hand in the specific shorthand of a man reporting all is well without needing to say so. This ranch, these people, this particular summer that had started as a debt and a document, and the specific cold arithmetic of survival. Martha appeared in the doorway behind them. "There's pie," she said with the tone of a woman making an announcement that is not optional. "Thomas is already in there, and if you don't come in, he'll eat both portions." "He absolutely will," Claire agreed. She turned toward the door, and Ethan moved with her, and as she passed Martha in the doorway, Martha reached out briefly and pressed her hand once, dry, firm, quick, and released it before it could become a moment. Martha did not do moments. She did pie and coffee, and 11 years of steadfast loyalty to a house she'd watched go quiet with grief, and was now watching go loud with something better. Claire squeezed back equally brief and went inside. Thomas had not in fact eaten both portions. He had eaten 1.5 and was visibly containing himself with great effort, and when Ethan sat down across from him, Thomas looked at Ethan's face, and then at Claire's face and back, and something settled in the line of his 17-year-old shoulders that had not been settled since the morning the bankmen came and took the inventory. "Everything all right?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Claire said. "Actually all right, or the kind of all right where you're managing me." "Actually all right," she said. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him with the flat gray gaze that had once been unreadable, and was now to Claire at least entirely legible. "You're staying," Thomas said to Claire. "Not the arrangement, not the contract. You." "Yes," she said. Thomas picked up his fork. "Good," he said with the elaborate casualness of a boy who has strong feelings. "He is not going to perform. The north fence needs replacing before winter anyway." Martha made a sound that was almost certainly a laugh and covered it with a cough that convinced no one. Outside the summer held the Montana Territory in its long, unhurried light, the kind of evening that doesn't know. It's an ending because it's also a beginning and doesn't need to be told the difference. The ranch breathed around them alive and imperfect and worth the trouble. Every fence and field and fractious hand and difficult season worth the trouble because this was what it meant to stay. Not that everything was fixed or simple or done, but that you had decided it was worth the continuing worth the next problem and the next worth being present for all of it. Claire Whitmore had come to Calloway Ranch on a contract with a debt and a brother and 6 months and a closed heart. She left none of those things behind her when she stayed. She carried them forward, changed but intact into a life that had not been planned and did not need to have been, because the best things rarely are. She had not been bought. She had not been rescued. She had not been placed in this story by anyone's arrangement or anyone's design. She had walked through a door, found what needed finding, stood where standing was needed, and chosen with clear eyes and a full accounting of the cost to remain. That was not a contract. That was not convenience. That was not 6 months on a page in a lawyer's office. That was the only kind of love worth having, the kind that knows exactly what it's choosing and chooses it anyway.